Welcome to the first episode of Tournament Hero Guide. In this episode, I will talk about Daru, one of my favorite tournament heroes. I highly recommend him for new players because he is very easy to draft, but that doesn't mean that he's weak. On the contrary, I consider him to be a top tier hero. So, what is it about Daru that I'm praising him so much? Let's find out. His ability reads plus one draw per turn, plus one hand size. In simple terms, this means that you will be able to draw four cards per turn as opposed to three as normal. This ability is strictly better than Pokchi's, but it doesn't make Daru a strictly better hero than him because Pokchi is more well rounded. This ability makes him a very flexible hero. Any generic good deck will work on Daru, but there are some decks that you should always try to build when playing him. More on those later. His ability is what I call a scaling ability, which means that it gets better over time, as opposed to Sang's ability, which just gives you one magic all the time. You might ask, but he only draws one extra card per turn all the time, so what's the difference? The difference is drawing cards late game usually provides you more value than in early game. And this ability doesn't have the disadvantage of starting out very weak. That is very typical among its peers. For example, Vex ability, which gives you gold when your opponent attacks. But in the early stages of the game, usually you don't have a lot of allies that would make your opponent attack you. But Daru, even in the early game, you will be able to draw one extra coin, which gives you one extra gold, which is very solid for a starting point. So now we know that Daru's ability is very good, which naturally translates to Lucky. And I think Lucky is almost always an auto pick on Daru because you will get the effect on the same turn you play it. The drawing happens at the end of the turn, so even in the worst case scenario where Lucky dies on your opponent's turn, it's already paid for itself by the extra cards that you draw at the end of your turn. So you should always consider Lucky even when you don't have any walls to protect it. So Lucky is a good card for Daru, but which other cards are also good for him? The first and most obvious among these are Vest cards because redraw. There are two types of Vest cards that I want to separate. The first is what I call cycle cards. This means you get the effect when you play, and the second one is the ally cards. It's self-explanatory. Usually on Daru, cycle cards are better because you have more chances to redraw them and you don't have to worry about protecting your allies. There's also the synergy with rights, which I will talk about in details later. Okay, so I just mentioned rights, and yes, they are very good on Daru as well because when playing rights, you want to redraw them more often and you want to play them on a longer chain. Well, Daru provides you with both of that. The next cards that are also very good on Daru are Go Potis and Aurochs Elixir. These cards work best when you can redraw and replay them repeatedly. Daru lets you do that. So let's talk about some good decks on Daru. The first and the strongest is the right build. You play either Rite of Brute or Rite of Combat with Vest Cycle cards. Usually you should prefer Rite of Brute because it provides you with both econ and control in just one card. And sometimes when you play against Vex, playing Rite of Combat is just really not an option. But make no mistake, Rite of Combat is still a very viable option on Daru, and you will still win games very often by taking Rite of Combat. This is actually what I consider to be the best build in tournament. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is the strongest build, but it is best because of how easy it is to build, how consistent it is, how fast it can win you games, and the fact that there is very little counterplay to it. It's easy because the only really difficult part is getting it right, but there are two of them. So the chances are not terribly low. And even without rights, when you pick a bunch of Vest Cycle cards, it's still a very decent deck on Daru because there are tons and tons of Vest Cycle cards in the game. This means that when attempting to build this deck, in the worst case scenario, you will end up with a still decent deck, which consists of a lot of Vest Cycle cards. Is consistent because his ability lets you replay Rise more often than any other hero in the game. Even if you are unlucky and you don't get an early Rise restock, you can just play Vest cards until you have it, and those Vest cards will still provide you with enough sustainability. It's also very fast because your right chains will be longer than normal, and when you can play long right chains often, you will be able to end games very quickly. Most of my fastest tournaments are with this build. It has little counterplay because it doesn't rely on allies, so it isn't susceptible to strong control decks from your opponent. It's only really vulnerable to mass card stealing effects, but you rarely see that in tournaments. The next build is Vest Cycle cards with Shrine of Rebirth. It's a lot slower than right build, but it actually scales better into late game when you have multiple shrines because they will allow you to go infinite quite easily. Around 4 or 5 shrines, and you will be able to go infinite quite consistently. There's a catch to it though. Usually, you will have to draft a Synod in order to keep restocking Shrine of Rebirth. The next build is a combination of the previous ones. If you are lucky enough to get this build, you will win at least 90% of games. Well, Vest Rides are already very fast, but when you combine it with Shrines, it gets even crazier. The next build is Potis and Elixir. It's good and fairly consistent as well, but it's harder to draft because you will have to also draft some control and econ support, especially in the case of Elixir. And usually you will need some alternative win condition if you don't have a second copy of either Potis or Elixir or Synod in your deck. This build is also very vulnerable to Mayhem unless you have cards like Fist or Repopulation, which requires even more support in deck building. You could actually combine this kind of build with Rights. It's okay, but it's not really ideal because Potis in Elixir reduces your chance of redrawing Rights. When you play Rights, you just want to play it over and over again. You could make a hybrid build if you want, but it won't be as good as a Riot and purely Vest cards. It may or may not be better than pure Potis or Elixir build, depending on the other support cards you get from the packs. A generic deck is also a good build on Daru. What I mean by a generic deck is some good allies, some good wars to protect them, some good econ and control support. But this kind of build requires more effort when playing because there isn't a lot of synergy with the hero. Next, I will show you one of my recent builds with commentary. In this first pack, we have two Vest allies in Courtesan and Vintner, but as a first pick, Courtesan is always better than Vintner, so I take Courtesan. Next one, we have Harvest and Warship to consider, but at this stage in the drafting phase, Warship is too early because I'm not sure if I can have enough econ support for it, so I just take Harvest, which is safer. We have Vintner again, but we also have Mayhem, which is an auto pick. And yet another Vintner. But this time we also have Assassin, which makes for some interesting interactions with our draft so far. You can see that I was really hesitating to pick Vintner there. But after thinking about it for a little bit, I decided to go with Assassin for two reasons. The first reason is, at this point I don't have any walls to protect Courtesan, and it's just not safe to assume that I will have some good walls to protect it. So if I really want to use Assassin, I would have to combo it with Courtesan and Harvest, which makes it a three-piece combo. And for me, three-piece combos are usually not worth it because they are very consistent. The only exceptions are when they are auto wins, which is not in this case. Sure, I might do a lot of damage with this combo, but I highly doubt I will be able to win games with with just this combo. The second reason is Assassin and Harvest would be quite useless for me in the early stages of the game. And here I've only opened 4 packs. There's a chance that the remaining packs will give me terrible options, and I have to pick some that are also equally useless for me in the early game. So if I pick Assassin here, I will just put myself at the risk of having a very unoptimal deck for not a really good reward. So in the end, oh, actually, there is another reason why I should pick Vincent here, but I didn't think about it at the time. I only realized it now while making this video. If you remember, this is already the third pack that I have Vintner in, which means this is the very last chance I have to pick Vintner if I want it in my deck, which I kinda do, because it's a cheap Vest ally that gives me 2 damage per turn. And if I want Assassin for whatever reason, I could leave it for chances to have it in another pack. So in the end, I think Winner makes the most sense here. Here we have an easy choice in Shrine of Rebirth. The other cards are just not worth it compared to this one. Here we have two okay choices between Gilded General and Prayer, but Gilded General needs support, which which I don't have at the moment. So I just go with Prayer because I already have some synergy with other Vest allies, with other Vest cards, and I also have Shrine of Rebirth for synergy with it. Here we have yet two other Vest cards, and both are very good actually. But at this point, I need a wall to protect my Courtesan and Vincner, so I go with Palisade. If I didn't have Palisade in this pack though, I would still be perfectly happy taking Ballista. This one is a debatable choice. At this point, I don't really have a lot of econ support. The only thing I have is Shrine of Rebirth, and that's pretty much it. Which might not be enough for tribute, especially in the early game. And Go Potis is actually a pretty good choice as well because it's very affordable. It gives me more allies for synergy with Harvest, and it can be saved by Shrine of Rebirth as well. But I like my builds to be I like my builds to be purer, so I take tribute. But I wouldn't agree with anyone who said I should pick Potis instead. Here we have another Vest card, but it's really not an option anymore because it's too expensive. If I didn't pick Tribute in the previous pack, I might consider it here, but since I did pick Tribute, there's just no way I will be able to afford Harvest, Tribute, and Knight with just Shrine of Rebirth as econ support. So my only really viable options in this pack are Surveillance, Staff of Requiem, and Sabotage. Now, Surveillance provides me with some control, which isn't really necessary because I already have Mayhem and Prayer, but it's cheap, so it's not terrible. The next one is Staff of Requiem, which is a slower alternative to Mayhem, and I actually don't mind using it on my board because most of my cards are Vest, and I can easily recycle them due to the nature of Vest cards. The worst that could happen is I will wipe out some of my Shrine of Rebirths, which isn't that bad because I doubt I will have that many in the first place, and I will still have some magic from wiping them out. Sabotage is really only useful for slowing down my opponents in the early game. After the early game, it just really doesn't have any more usage. But honestly, all of these cards are pretty lame at this point in the draft. So at the end, I made the decision based on cost because I just want to save more gold to buy my tribute, and sabotage cost the least here. Finally, the MVP, or should I say MVC. This this card just makes this whole deck 10 times better. There is no decision to make here. This card is practically screaming at me to pick it, and there's no way I can deny it. And that's the end of my draft. And of course, this build went 8-0. It took me only around 10 minutes to complete this run. My final verdict on Daru is he's easily among the top tier heroes, and I highly recommend him for new and old players alike. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you soon in the next video. Goodbye and stay safe.